Thank you all for joining me. This is a presentation on Kanban at the Department of Labor. A little bit about me. My name is Joey Spooner. I have about 15 years of experience in technology management and software development. I have a focus and kind of awkward excitement about working on small teams. I like working on problems that are small rather than these big problems. I've got a background in product design and development. I've also been an accredited Kanban trainer for the past 6 months or so, and a Kanban coaching professional for coming up on a year. And I'm also a certified Scrum Master in my spare time. So this is the Department of Labor. How many of you have actually been to this department by any chance? A few hands, good. It's a 2 million square foot facility as far as what I'm told. Very big, great for exercise. I worked in a small area of the Department of Labor. So inside the Department of Labor, there's this thing called the Office of Public Affairs. Inside that is a small division called the Division of Electronic Communications. And that's what we're talking about today. So when I first started out working with these folks, the technical team manager asked me a simple question. He said, "How can you help me to see into the work?" He was experiencing problems working with his team. They would sit down and every week or so write up a report of their work that was done and send it up to their program manager. Their program manager would then send it to him. And this would take maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks to do. So he was always getting lagging information. The funny part was they were all on the same floor. I mean, within walking distance, within talking distance. But every week or so, he would get information on how they're doing with a project. So in a lot of ways, the reports were a great mechanism for internal delay. It was really easy to say, okay, we can deal with this later, or we can buy ourselves a week or so to catch up on things that we've missed. There wasn't really a good understanding of risk. Risk was always being reported late. So this kind of became a wall. Not a great thing to have when you're trying to build software. One of the things I did when I first started out with this team to help actually see into the work was to visualize. So one of the first practices of the Kanban method, visualization. So I didn't change anything they did. I just said, hey, let's put this on a board and see where you guys are. How much work do you have to do? What kind of work are you doing? And up here you see the columns, you see some rows maybe to describe some of the work they're doing. They were using, I believe, some kind of ticketing system like GitLab at the time. And we just made it really simple. I didn't ask anything of them more than to say, what are you working on today? Now we went through a few iterations of this over time where they said, well, we're doing Scrum. We're not going to give up Scrum. I said, great, let's not give up Scrum. But let's track the work that you're doing. So we started tracking the stories that they were working with in Scrum. They had low priority projects and high priority projects. But they also had these little tasks, and the engineers really wanted to track these tasks. They were big into that. I said, no problem, let's do that. So as you see here, we've got an API v2 and a URL shortener here. On the lower level with the Scrum activities, same thing. Stories on the top, tasks on the bottom. And this helped the developers to feel safe. They felt like they were still doing valuable work, but at the same time, it gave insight into the team manager's understanding of just what was going on. How are things adding up? And this is the other end of it. So as work completed here on the lower level, those tickets moved across on the upper level. Now, something we did not too far after we got started was to start putting in some WIP limits. They didn't understand what that meant, but that was probably the most exciting part when we flipped those switches. So visualizing first was one step we went through, and then I want to say maybe 6 weeks, maybe 8 weeks into this, we put on WIP limits. So those are the limits. I think everyone understands this. Those are the limits around how much you're actually going to be able to work on in that given area. And when we did that, suddenly QA was having a conversation with development that they never had before, because QA was starved. They're like, come on guys, give us stuff. Or development was hammering QA with too much work, And suddenly they said, we can't work anymore. Great, we're stuck. Now these were teams that are, prior to this board, these were teams that were on the same floor but operated in a waterfall kind of isolated fashion. So QA really didn't talk to dev didn't really talk to security. These things just kind of happened in a big lump sum kind of approach. Now suddenly they were forced to have conversations they didn't have before. And I say forced because suddenly they were there talking about the same problem. That was great. Great for this result. So I think you guys understand this part here. So we got rid of the wall, and we effectively created a real wall, a good wall, a Kanban board. One thing that I like about this image in some ways is how it relates to some of the tribal nature or tribal behavior that you find in good cultures. One of the things that I think is great is it looks like a fire almost, like a good kind of campfire. So I don't know how many of you like to camp or how many of you have been out in the woods, but to me it reminds me of growing up as a kid and being around a campfire. You have something to talk about now that is objective, that is valuable and measurable. So this was something else we did which I think had a really positive outcome for the team. When we put together our system, we decided let's evolve those tickets a little bit further. And we used really simple methods. We used Excel and mail merge from Windows, from Microsoft Word. So what you're seeing here is a simple extract out of GitLab, nothing more than a copy-paste out of GitLab's ticketing system to capture the title and the ID of the ticket. We put that together in a mail merge with our stages, what we called stages of our development process. And we just tracked the simple date in and date out, and then who signed off on it. The most important part happened with the sign-off. Kind of like what Kirk talked about earlier, people cared. They actually cared about the work that was being done because their name was associated with it. And I didn't expect much to come of that. I just thought, okay, we know who's responsible. But actually it became this kind of badge of pride for the people who were doing the work. They said, I actually did the analysis on that work. And now you get to take it on, tester person. That was a huge thing. So I don't know if you guys do something like that today, if you have a way of doing that, but I found very positive outcomes there. So these were all proto-Kanban initiatives until about, I want to say maybe 12 months or more into this. So we were proto-Kanbaning a long time, and that was okay because the team was comfortable with that. They felt good about it. At the same time, as you see here, this is still in a proto-Kanban kind of experience. We didn't really have any formal policies. There were always some frustrations about what are we really doing, but still people were okay with this part of the work and tracking it. So we actually had performance data before we turned on what I consider to be a real Kanban system. So about a year into this, the manager says, this has been working fairly well, but I really want to see what all of Kanban has to offer. Can you actually do Kanban for us? So I had a 2-week notice to kind of make this happen, and I was happy to do it, but I didn't have the practice yet to really get it done. So in my mind, I ran to the next best thing. I was in a Kanban coaching masterclass that David provided about 3 or 4 months before I was asked to do this. And during that masterclass, he said, hey, by the way, there's this thing called the Kickstart Field Guide that you may want to look into that helps you implement Kanban into your organizations. And it's actually derived from a larger bureaucratic kind of organization, so it has that feel of dealing with silos and how to bring them together. And this is what we used. So when we went from kind of doing Kanban to really trying to get it done, we followed the kick there, the kickstarts. I talked to Christoph, who wrote most of this, I believe, and he said to me, well, you should be able to do most of Kick 1 through Kick 14 in about the course of a day. Now, we did this during the Christmas period right at the end of 2015. And we thought, okay, it's quiet, no one's doing anything, people have gone home except for the development team. We can do this without a problem. This will be a day. And it took us 3 days. Because one of the biggest challenges we ran into was the common language, the policies, and some of the WIP limits. So a lot of teams, I think they run into problems understanding how to say the same thing. I find that most of the problems I run into with teams are communication problems. And the policies piece. We decided that we wanted to be the best thing in the world when it came to software development. So we decided to really push ourselves to try and build as high a quality of product as possible. But the reality is, I'm sure some of you have heard this before, you have champagne dreams, but you have a beer budget. We kind of had that, right? And so we realized later on that we had to dial down those policies. We came up with something like 22 policies for our Kanban system, which was just ginormous. And we decided, yeah, we got to dial that down. And the way we learned that was, you can't see it a whole lot here. Yeah, you don't see it on this one, but we used a different approach, and I don't have a screenshot of it, but we actually tracked those policies that we said we're going to do these things at each stage of our work. So in development, we'll run test-driven design. We'll actually do unit tests on the code. And then in QA, we'll actually run those unit tests one more time before we process it and run the tests for the overall application. Some of those things we did, some of those things we couldn't do because of the pressure around the work. But we tracked those things when we didn't do them. So we really wanted to track when we couldn't follow through on our work, on our process policies. And that helped us to refine the process overall. So something we did to grow up. Now we're on a constant journey of growing up. That was the fun part about this. We started off with really kind of a Scrum process, but not really something that was Scrum. They just kind of tried it out. Then we moved into doing Proto Kanban for about a year. After that, we then turned on this full Kanban system. And with that, our approach was we got to use these cadences. And along the way, we reminded ourselves, don't freak out. You can do your policies, but you got to respect them. So one of the things that I've seen with this team in particular, but with other teams now, is this challenge of we're going to have these policies. And these are simple things, like I'm sure you guys have had these before. You get up in the morning, you're going to make sure that you eat a healthy bowl of food before you get on the road and get to work. But once a week or twice a week, you start to realize, I don't have that kind of time available to me. I'm just going to rush. I'm going to grab a snack bar or something and hit the road. That's kind of what happened here. People would get excited about the work, they would get anxious about the work, or they would feel pressured by the work to be done by a certain period of time. And they would miss their policies. They'd miss some of those policies. So that's just a quick tangent on how that worked out. So to try and help us reflect on this, to help us grow on some of the mistakes we're making, but also some of the progress we were making, we had the daily planning meeting. So every day, we worked the board. So just to get a bead on the room here, how many of you actually have Kanban systems right now that you're working with? Good. Okay, so most of you know what I'm about to say. That's good to hear. So on the daily planning meeting, we'd work right to left, looking for those delays, looking for those risks. And that was always the hardest conversation because everyone was excited about what came next. And there's something in psychology called the hedonic treadmill. If you haven't learned about that, you probably would benefit from reading a little bit on it because everyone, and I'm sure you've experienced this too, everyone wants to bring in the next thing. They want that next new thing to do. The problem is that in daily planning, you're saying, what are we going to finish today? What can you deliver for me today? And that was a big question we had every day. The sad part was it's hard to get something done in a highly constructive environment like the Department of Labor in some cases to actually have it delivered today to the customer. Lots of checks and balances there. The service delivery review, we actually sat down about every 2 weeks and we went through every aspect of what we did. We checked our performance, we checked our policies, and we tried to figure out how to grow. And that was a hard conversation because a lot of the developers who were new to this were still kind of bucking it and saying, I don't know, I don't think this works for us. So we actually had to have those conversations of figuring out what made sense. Again, it was almost like tuning a bike in some ways. You had to get it to where it was really aligned. Later on, we tried replenishment meetings, and we did that maybe about 4 weeks into what we did. Into our implementation. Now that replenishment, it was challenging because you have past behaviors of Scrum activity coming into play. So they're thinking we've got to create a good ordered backlog of priorities. We've got to know exactly how much effort's involved in all of this. And thankfully, the questions that came out of I don't know if you guys have seen the LKCE 15 presentation. I think it was that one, where Janice went through the cadences and actually has questions that goes with the cadences that really guide you through those meetings. If you haven't seen that, that's a very useful presentation to go through. We went through that to actually help guide our replenishment meeting activities. And that helped because we would have a big problem of wanting to size things, of wanting to make sure that everything was prioritized exactly accordingly, trying to predict that future. And I think over time we learned that that was not as valuable. And then last but not least, we also did the delivery planning meeting. And these are the questions that came out of the LKCE 15 slide deck for delivery planning. And I like them a lot because I think they ask really good questions. The fourth bullet point down there, what risks are involved? How are risks being mitigated? Now these are common questions that you think to ask, but when you're working in a traditional, what I call traditional siloed organizational model, these become challenging questions. We decided to take one of our projects and follow through this approach to say, let's do delivery planning and let's have a meeting with the delivery team on the other side. So we were not a full stack team. We could only work inside a small area. We worked with the customers who asked for things, we provided the software, then we handed that off to a delivery team. So the delivery team, we wanted to see if they would be willing to have this conversation. Now this was a new delivery team with cutting edge professionals, right? These guys knew what they were doing, they were into DevOps, they wanted to really advance the department down the road faster, better, stronger. When we got to question number 4, they said, well, I think we've got it. This meeting's over, we're good. And we said, really? You guys want to end this conversation this soon? I mean, this isn't hard stuff, but are you sure you want to do that? And they said, yeah, we're good. We're good. We can handle this for you, no problem. And that taught us something as well, because while we were inside creating our little bubble of what I would call maturity as a team, you have to recognize the fact that on either side of that, the upstream or downstream, they may not be running at the same pace as you. And that's a hard thing to accept, but that's what we had to accept in this case. So now we moved on into measurement and forecasting. So at the very beginning of this implementation of doing Kanban, I was pretty key on tracking the performance, because one of the questions that was asked of me at the very beginning when I was asked to say, hey, how do you visualize this work? I was also asked, can you help us forecast the future? How long will it take us? How much capability does this team have? Because we got plenty of demand on the government side, but how do we balance this out? So I believe you guys saw that we tracked using a mail merge Excel combination. So Excel was my friend. I used Excel a lot. And we're not talking about complex stuff in Excel. Imagine this more or less being brought into an Excel worksheet, and that's all we tracked. Now there's some stuff by a guy named Troy McGinnis. I don't know if you guys have looked at that yet, but we've used some of his stuff. And we also used another tool, which I'll show you in just a moment, to do our analysis. I think most of you get this. I may be kind of preaching on the mound here, but we covered those 3 basic areas of performance. How much did we have in process over 2 weeks? How much was the throughput over 2 weeks? What was our cycle time? One thing that I like, I don't know if you guys pay attention to this too much, is how much were we taking in versus how much were we pulling out? Because in any reasonable size system, you can say, I can take on a little bit more, right? That hedonic treadmill mindset kicks in. I can pull in just a little bit more now. But the outgoing is kind of not going. Now this is data from this real team. So from 2014 to 2015, it'd take us about 55 days to get something done. The fun part is right here, right after UAT done, that was a separate team, but we decided to track our downstream provider because we needed to provide answers to our customers. They wanted to know, how long would it take you guys on average to get something done? The manager of this team wanted to know that answer as well. He wanted to make sure that he had a good answer to give to his constituents within the department. So we would pay attention to things like, why is it hanging out so long in analysis when we're done with it? Those were questions that we'd ask in our service delivery review meetings. We wanted to make sure that we addressed a lot of our delays here. So I'm sure some of you guys look at flow efficiency. I think that's great, but in my mind, I'm trying to put the dots together for the people who are working there on the software development team. I wanted them to understand, okay, you feel like you got a good week there. You got a good 2 weeks. You feel like you crushed it, so to speak. But in reality, you might have come out a little bit less better than you thought. Emotionally it's good, but does the data say it's good as well? And this shows you right here with our CFD. I'm not going to get into the metrics behind the CFD. I just like some of the basic visualizations that it can show you. So right here, you can see how we go from, oh, we're doing, but then suddenly, whoa, what happened here? And that's the phase gate release model from the release team. They said, we're not going to release incrementally, we're going to release all at once. And that was a Windows team, by the way. They said, we're not going to take incrementals, give us everything at once. So keep in mind, this is a reflection of a team that's slowly becoming more mature in how they do their work. They're trying to focus on reducing their times. As you can see up here, we get better at reducing those times. Those lead times, those cycle times. But right here at the bottom, that's still the government silo operating as a silo. And I like this because it makes it really easy to show someone in a management level, hey, look, we went from kind of not doing so great to getting ourselves together, doing better. But by the way, the team below us, they're still doing things in big lumps. So the question of when will it be done, when will it be delivered to the customer, we have to factor that in as well. So we ask questions like this. How long will this new item take if we pull it in? Now, these are basic questions, but we had to have these questions answered almost every service delivery review meeting or every time we decided to replenish. We'd say, okay, what is it going to really take for us to get this done? And we had the really fun one. So what's refutable and what's irrefutable? It's easy for us to refute small change requests. It's easy for us to refute things that are perceived as low risk on our end. But when the right people called, it was, how soon can we get this to you? We're going to get this even to you sooner if possible. So that last bullet there, how can we reduce delay? That was kind of the big deal behind those things. We typically looked at what can we sacrifice to make this work. So when you're talking about having something like 22 policies over, I think you saw it was something like 7 columns of work. The big issue there is, what can we sacrifice? So suddenly you're doing, I think, what is prioritized thinking. You're not going through and trying to figure out, we need to check off this, this, and this to get the 22 policies completed. Suddenly you're saying, no, we only need really 7. So that's something I ran into with this team. They really thought, in some ways, ideally what would be best. But the reality was, you only needed, I think, probably about 7 policies to run this system. One of the tools that we used to help us do our forecasting was actionable agile analytics. I think some of you have seen this. I find it very useful to use. I could take that spreadsheet, pull it right into this environment, and get the forecasting data out of this, as well as the cycle times. So it saved me a lot of time, a lot of headache. Plus, there were great meetings that would happen out of this. Sometimes when we had service delivery review meetings, we would be looking at the next kind of big project that was coming down the road. And there would be this sort of optimistic discussion of, okay, I think we can do that in 30 business days. I say, great, let's take a look at all of our history that we have tracked so far. And let's look at the the Monte Carlo forecast for this and see how far it tells us we're really going to be. Let's let the data tell us as well. So we had people saying, we think it's going to be 30 days. I said, great, let's run the Monte Carlo. It came out to be like 95 days. And they said, oh, no, that's not real. That's because we had a couple of bad moments there in that period of time, and that's why this data is kind of pushed out a little bit further for the forecasted time frame. 95 days later, that work would be completed, and suddenly they kind of scratch their heads and go, you know what? Maybe that's real. Maybe that's real data that we're working with. Because it's hard. It's hard for people to believe that things take as long as they do. My wife gets on me all the time. She'll say, how long does it take for you to drive over to here? And I'll be like, oh, it takes me 15 minutes. And she's like, it takes me 40. What are you thinking? Like, how are you breaking the law to do that? So that's something that I think we run into, is this sense of optimistic forecasting, when there has to be a little bit more realistic forecasting with data. So I wanted to share with you a little bit of the technology that we use for this effort. When we were looking at technology, we had some challenges here, because we're not the the commercial environment. We're not the startup that can do just about anything. We had regulations around us and security requirements around us. How many of you guys work on government contracts or work with the government right now? Hey, all right, cool. So you know exactly what I'm talking about. So it had to be firewall ready. We could not have it outside in the cloud. For policy reasons, they would not let us go out to the cloud. So it had to be something that could run inside our firewall. It had to be extendable, so we wanted to customize it. And it had to be on the money. So it had to be cheap, in other words, reasonably priced. That's why we ended up with Jira. Now, how many of you guys use Jira right now? I'm just curious. I feel your pain. Or your excitement. I don't know. It depends on how you work with it. So I have mixed feelings about it. Sometimes I go, I can break this in 5 minutes with what I really want to do. Other times I go, all right, good. It's useful for the end user. So we used a combination of Jira, Excel, and actual agile analytics to manage our Kanban system. We did have a saying, too. Once we moved into Jira, we said either it happened to Jira or it didn't happen at all. So we need to see you actually recording your activities there in Jira. A lot of teams, I think you guys probably run into this, too. They'll use email for a long time or some other kind of tool, and then you say, OK, we're now moving to this tool. And changing that behavior is really hard. Right now, I'm working with a corporation, and they've all agreed we're going to do it all in Jira, and then I see emails flying around where they're talking about the work through email. I'm like, guys, come on. You're never going to know how this really turns out for you unless you start to use the tool that you said you would use. So for this team in particular, you saw those status reports at the beginning. Basically, we said your status report will be derived from your activity in this system. So if you're communicating, if you're collaborating, if you're tracking your work in this system, congratulations. It's going to be really easy for us to see that you're doing your job. If you're not doing that, we're going to have a harder time believing what you're saying. In terms of performance, before we put in what I consider to be a full Kanban system with policies like WIP limits, knowing when things are done in various areas of your process, and really tracking our WIP and trying to reduce our WIP, we had a lead time of 55 days. Now, lead time is the big deal. We could look at our daily WIP, we could look at our throughput, we could look at our arrival, but when the conversations were had at the table with other managers, it was, how long will this take? Not how much, but how long. Size was somewhat arbitrary. So we focused on lead time quite a bit and managing that through our WIP limits. When we were doing Proto-Kanban, we weren't that focused on it. We just kind of tracked it just to track it. And we had 55 days, as you saw earlier, on the lead time. Once we started doing real, I'd say, WIP management, we went down to 11 days. That's a really good response. I think that's really exciting. One of the things we ran into was we weren't churning out as much as we were pulling in. So that was one of our problems. Again, we had that problem of wanting to eat more than we actually had room to eat. The bar chart, I think, just makes it kind of pretty, kind of shows you size-wise what this really looks like. But to actually put it in percentage terms is pretty impressive. So 80% improvement overall. Now, we also did this with a non-technical team, something called a governance and security team. Same area, same problem. But instead of doing the Kickstart field guide, we use static. So how many of you have read the book Kanban from the Inside? Handful? Yeah, if you haven't read that, that's a good book to read as well to help you get through a lot of your Kanban implementations. And inside that book is something called static, which is really useful. It refers to systems thinking as applied to implementing Kanban. The acronym's really cute. I like that. But saying it all is a mouthful. When we used static, we got even better results. We went from 55 to 5.5 days. I think that even shocked the team when they actually started doing this. Now, you'll notice the throughput kicks up as well, and the arrival rate is also higher too. Now, there is one big difference with this team. We added one person. That's all we did differently there. So I don't know how many of you have read David's original book on Kanban, but he does go into this a little bit about what does it mean to add one more person to your team. Because there's always this discussion of, well, we need to double the team size. But if you look at the impact of adding just one person, it's pretty evident that it's pretty high. So again, that's a 90% improvement in performance. Performance being the lead time. So we were looking at fitness somewhat from a qualitative perspective, definitely from a security perspective, but also from how soon can we get this done.